In 2020, there was an incident that took place at my granddaughter's school.
The shocking truth behind Marcus Lamb's death has just been revealed, and it's all in Joni Lamb's private diary. For years, the public has only seen the image of a grieving widow, but what's hidden inside those pages will completely change everything you thought you knew. Secrets, untold stories, and heart-stopping revelations that will leave you questioning everything about Marcus's final days. You won't believe what's been uncovered. Get ready for the truth to hit harder than ever before. The sudden death of Marcus Lamb in November 2021 took everyone by surprise. As the charismatic leader of Daystar television network, Marcus had been a major figure in Christian media. He had a large following, with many viewers tuning in every day to watch his programs. His voice, full of passion and conviction, resonated with millions of people who admired his outspoken views on faith, politics, and society. So when he passed away, it sent shockwaves not just through his family but through the entire Christian community. Marcus had been battling COVID-19 for a short time before his death. The official cause was complications from the virus, which seemed to align with the timeline of the pandemic. He had long been known for his outspoken stance against COVID-19 lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and other government-imposed restrictions. He had criticized the government's handling of the pandemic and stood firm in his beliefs that personal freedoms were being violated. In many ways, his sudden death felt like tragic irony to his followers, who were left grappling with the idea that the very virus he had spoken so passionately against had taken his life.
We turn now to Texas, where controversial Christian television CEO Marcus Lamb has died after his battle with COVID-19. The conservative televangelist making headlines this past year after his network, Daystar, dedicated hours of broadcasts to anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination activists and groups.
At first, the response was one of mourning. His wife, Joni Lamb, and their children, along with the vast network of followers, were consumed by grief. Marcus had been the face of Daystar, and his sudden absence left a massive void. His death seemed to mark the end of an era, and many saw it as a cruel twist of fate. The world that Marcus had built, the ministry, the network, and the legacy, was suddenly without its guiding figure. And for those who had followed him for years, it was almost impossible to process. In the days following Marcus's passing, there was an outpouring of sympathy. Viewers sent their condolences, and many people shared stories of how Marcus's teachings had touched their lives. It seemed like a simple, tragic loss, an unexpected and heartbreaking end to a life lived in the public eye. Joni Lamb, understandably, was at the center of it all. She gave interviews, thanking supporters for their prayers and speaking of the deep loss she felt. It was clear that she was grieving, and many sympathized with her pain. She was a widow, suddenly thrust into the spotlight at a time of unimaginable heartache. But as the days and weeks went on, something started to feel off. What initially seemed like a clear-cut tragedy began to raise more questions than answers. People who had worked with Marcus closely, family members, and even staff at Daystar, began to feel like something wasn't adding up. It wasn't that they didn't believe the official story, they just felt like there were too many details that didn't make sense. The timeline of events surrounding his death felt rushed. Everything moved too quickly. The funeral, the tributes, the public mourning. It all seemed to unfold in a way that left some feeling unsettled. As the dust began to settle, whispers of doubt started to spread. The grief of losing Marcus was undeniable, but some people began asking whether his death was truly just a medical tragedy or if there was something more behind it. The concerns didn't come from outsiders. They came from people who had known the Lamb family intimately, people who had worked alongside Marcus for years. These weren't baseless rumors or conspiracy theories. These were people who had seen things that didn't quite sit right with them. There was a sense that something was being hidden, something that didn't add up.
My last night with Marcus at the hospital, I was taking care of him, and at around 3 o'clock in the morning, she said to me, she just looked at me in this dark room. I'm there serving, and she looked at me and she said, "Look what you have done to this family." I remember texting my mom saying, "I can't do this anymore. I told God, you feel the pain of my heart. Me and my child are ruining this family." And I said, "I know, my God, you're protective of me. You'll get me out of here." That was my last night. The next day, he dies.
The timeline was a big part of the issue. Marcus had seemed healthy just days before he was admitted to the hospital. He was still active, still doing his work, and still very much involved in the ministry. So when he suddenly fell ill and passed away so quickly, many were left questioning if there had been underlying health issues that hadn't been made public. Had Marcus been ill for longer than anyone had known? Were there signs that something was wrong that were missed or overlooked? These were uncomfortable questions to ask, but they lingered in the air. Some people began to wonder if there were decisions being made behind closed doors that no one was willing to talk about. The fact that Marcus had been outspoken against the very virus that ultimately claimed his life added another layer of complexity to the situation. It was hard for people to reconcile the man who had spoken out so fervently against lockdowns and vaccines with the man who suddenly succumbed to COVID-19. The irony was too much for some to ignore. Was it just a tragic coincidence, or was there more to it? Had his stance against the pandemic influenced how he approached his own health? Was he more vulnerable than anyone realized? In the weeks following his death, the story began to shift from mourning to suspicion. While the public was still focused on the loss, the people closest to Marcus, the ones who had worked alongside him for years, began to question the way things had played out. They weren't sure what they were seeing, but they couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. It wasn't just that Marcus had died. It was the way everything unfolded so quickly, the way people seemed to be moving on with their lives before the grieving had even begun. For some, it felt like there was a rush to fill the void that Marcus had left, to keep the ministry moving forward as if nothing had changed. And then there was Joni's behavior. She stepped into the spotlight almost immediately after Marcus's death, giving interviews and publicly expressing her grief. She thanked supporters, spoke about her loss, and appeared strong in the face of the tragedy. But to those who were watching closely, her rapid transition from widowhood to moving on with her life seemed too fast. The questions that had begun as whispers now became louder. Was Joni truly grieving, or was there something else at play? The way she carried herself in public seemed out of step with the deep sadness that one would expect after such a loss.
I went to Daystar one afternoon to grab something from the cafe. There was something in the green room, and I had my child with me, and I knew she was scared at this point, so we didn't take her there anymore. We had a nanny at home with her. But this one time, I wanted to pick up something really quick. I go in there. It's in the afternoon. I didn't think anyone would be in the green room. And I take her with me, and it's horrible. I go to grab that box of food, and in walks Pete and, his spouse. And my child was so full of terror. Her body went completely limp, and she fell under the table hard. I grabbed her little body. I picked her up, and I ran into the car. And I remember telling other family members about it, the ones I trusted, and it was traumatic. I was like, I'm not bringing my child here.
As the weeks passed, the doubts grew and the whispers of suspicion turned into more direct questions. Was Marcus's death truly just a tragedy, or had something else been at play? The timeline, the behavior of those closest to him, and the way everything seemed to happen so quickly, all of these things raised red flags. What began as a simple, heartbreaking loss soon morphed into a mystery that people couldn't ignore. And for those who had once trusted the Lamb family and Daystar, the truth of Marcus's death had become something far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Joni Lamb's rapid transition after Marcus Lamb's sudden death raised more than a few eyebrows. The widow of the late Marcus Lamb, who had been a powerful figure in Christian media, quickly became the center of attention. Initially, her grief was expected, and she publicly expressed the heartache she felt after losing her husband, who had passed away from complications due to COVID-19 in November 2021. She gave emotional interviews, shared her sorrow, and thanked the supporters who rallied around her. The entire Christian community mourned with her, as Marcus had been an influential voice in the televangelist world for decades. However, as the weeks went by, Joni's actions seemed to move in a direction that raised more and more questions. What was initially seen as a widow's grief slowly evolved into something more complex. Just weeks after Marcus's death, Joni seemed to begin the process of moving on, not only from the loss of her husband, but from the way she had lived her life up until that point. This wasn't unusual, necessarily. Grief affects everyone differently. But it was the speed with which Joni transitioned that caught the attention of those closest to her. Family members, staff at Daystar television network, and even those who had been longtime supporters of the Lamb family began to notice that Joni wasn't just grieving. She seemed to be moving forward at a pace that many found unsettling. At the heart of the shift was Joni's growing relationship with Doug Weiss, a counselor who had known the Lamb family for years. Doug Weiss, a Christian counselor with his own background in working with people who had struggled with addiction, failed marriages, and broken faith, seemed like an unlikely figure for Joni to latch onto so quickly. At first, their relationship appeared to be nothing more than a professional friendship. Doug had been involved with Daystar for some time, offering counsel to people within the ministry. And after Marcus's death, Joni sought his support as someone who could help her navigate her grief. But as the weeks passed, their relationship began to take on a new tone.
You know, they did show me some stuff, text messages, emails, and some other paperwork that I said, okay, you know, now I'm going to have to go back and talk to Jonathan and Susie, and I'm going to do that this morning to hear their side. But what I will not do, I'm not going to keep going back and forth, back and forth. I saw what they showed me. I heard both sides of the story. You know, I felt some things in the spirit when I was talking to Jonathan and Susie. I definitely felt some things, you know, when I went to Daystar. And I'm going to post this interview today. I'm going to let everybody chop it up, dissect it, criticize, say, hey, I'm going to post the interview because that's the fair thing, the right thing. People can feel whatever they want to feel about it. And then I'm going to make a third and final video where I share, you know, what they showed me, there's some stuff they showed me and it was like, I have to go talk to Jonathan and Susie, and then I'm going to get Jonathan and Susie's response to, you know, the things that they showed me, and I already started talking to them about it, and I'm going to make the final video, and I'm going to wash my hands of it.
What started as casual meetings and conversations about grief soon became more intimate. Doug was no longer just a counselor to Joni. He became her confidant, her emotional support, and, eventually, someone with whom she was seen publicly attending events. For many, the relationship seemed to evolve far too quickly. Less than 2 months after Marcus's death, Doug filed for divorce from his wife of over 30 years. The timing was peculiar, and to many, it felt as though everything was moving at an unnervingly fast pace. Joni, too, had been widowed for barely a few weeks before her bond with Doug grew visibly stronger. Their closeness began to raise suspicions, especially when Joni started posting pictures on social media of the two of them together, smiling, laughing, and looking more like a couple than two people grieving a loss. To those who had watched Joni and Marcus Lamb for years, the change was dramatic. Marcus had been the face of Daystar, and Joni had always been his steady partner. Together, they had built the network into one of the largest Christian media platforms in the world. Joni had been the supportive wife, always in the background, complementing Marcus's public persona. She had played a key role in the network's success, but she had always maintained a somewhat reserved position in the spotlight. When Marcus passed, Joni was thrust into the public eye, but her presence was initially marked by a widow's sorrow and respect for her late husband's memory. But now, with Doug Weiss by her side, something had shifted. The grief had seemed to give way to something else. Was it truly grief? Or was Joni moving on quickly for another reason? Joni's relationship with Doug began to take on a life of its own. They started appearing together at events, speaking as if they were a couple, and even sharing moments of personal connection in front of the public. The emotional interviews Joni gave were now framed by her growing closeness to Doug. She spoke about how much she appreciated his support, how much she needed someone to lean on, and how she felt like God had brought Doug into her life at a time when she was most vulnerable. She expressed how their bond had deepened over shared prayers, shared experiences of pain, and a shared understanding of what it meant to go through such a traumatic loss. However, for those watching closely, the rapid pace of this transition didn't sit right. Some of Marcus's closest friends, longtime staff members at Daystar, and even family members began to feel uneasy. The speed at which Joni moved on from her husband's death seemed inconsistent with the image of a grieving widow trying to cope with a sudden and heartbreaking loss. Her ability to so quickly embrace another person, especially someone like Doug Weiss, who had his own complicated background, raised questions about the depth of her grief. It was hard for many to reconcile the woman who had just lost her partner of decades with the woman who was now so publicly close to someone else. As the relationship between Joni and Doug deepened, the questions became even more pointed. Was there something more going on behind the scenes? Had Joni and Doug been close before Marcus's death? Was there an emotional connection that predated Marcus's passing? Was the speed of their relationship a sign of grief? Or was it something more calculated? For some, the timing of Doug's divorce, coupled with Joni's rapid shift, felt like the culmination of events that had been building for a long time.
Jonathan's disappointment in not getting his way only deepened when I married Dr. Doug Weiss, who has been such a blessing to me, the rest of my family, and Daystar. I can tell you that as a mother, as a grandmother, this situation saddens me deeply, and it grieves my heart because I love my family. I love all my children. I love my grandchildren. I love the work we've done together for so many years. And I had hoped that we could have resolved the situation in private. But now, Jonathan has given me no choice except to speak out. Everyone knows that we have dedicated our lives to spreading the love of Jesus. And to see it attacked by my son Jonathan and his wife is truly heartbreaking. I want to assure you that all the allegations that are circulating against myself and my late husband are completely false.
For those inside the Daystar network, things became tense. Staff members who had worked alongside Joni and Marcus for years began to notice that the decisions being made at Daystar were happening more quickly. Joni seemed to be taking on more control, making decisions without consulting others and pushing certain voices out. The mourning period was over, and now Joni was moving ahead with the network's future. Her future. Was this a woman in grief, or was this someone capitalizing on the moment to cement her own control? The whispers within Daystar grew louder, and as Joni's relationship with Doug became more public, the questions about her motives grew more serious. Some began to suspect that Marcus's death was not just a turning point in the Lamb family's life, but perhaps the beginning of a calculated shift in Daystar's leadership. Was Marcus's passing part of a larger plan to move Joni into a more central role, or even to bring Doug into the fold in a more significant way? The rumors grew, but no one had the full picture. Joni remained somewhat defensive about the growing suspicions, maintaining that her relationship with Doug was purely one of friendship and support, guided by God's will. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Doug Wiss was not a stranger to controversy. His background as a counselor who had worked with people struggling with broken relationships, addiction, and other issues was well known, but his personal life, including his own divorce, was murky. Some felt uncomfortable with his quick involvement in Joni's life, especially considering the rapid speed at which their bond grew. The fact that Doug had been a part of the Daystar world and was so quickly brought into the fold left many questioning his true intentions. As the weeks turned into months, it became harder to ignore the implications of Joni's actions. The relationship between Joni and Doug, which had started out as a comforting friendship in the wake of Marcus's death, now felt like something more. The public had watched Marcus and Joni together for years, and to see Joni moving on so quickly, especially with someone as controversial as Doug, left many feeling unsettled. The question of grief versus something deeper became the central issue. Was Joni truly grieving, or was she simply moving forward with her life, taking control in a way that few had expected? The speed with which Joni moved on from her husband's death, coupled with her growing relationship with Doug, left the Christian community divided. Some defended her, insisting that grief is a personal journey, and that Joni had every right to find comfort where she could. Others, however, questioned whether Joni was truly acting in the best interest of her family, Daystar, and the legacy Marcus had built. The whispers of doubt didn't stop, and as Joni's relationship with Doug Weiss became more apparent, the questions about her motives only grew louder. The transition from widow to potential new partner, all within a matter of months, raised serious concerns about what was happening behind the scenes at Daystar, and whether the Lamb family's vision was truly being honored, or if it was being reshaped in a new, troubling direction.
Yes, that's true, but also I would add that since this is such a absolutely deeply traumatic thing that we've gone through, obviously us sitting here can never fully express what we've walked through in these past few years. I mean, I don't even want to get into the process of what that looked like, but it was excruciatingly painful. So yes, there is that freedom in not having to depend on a few people and keep begging for justice and having it minimized and turned down, and just hitting a wall like a dead end. There's peace and satisfaction now. When the story came out and the way people received it, and I felt like the floodgates of justice opened on us when everyone validated what we as parents felt. We really wanted to do a short video. This is not the time or place that we want to get into our whole story. Jonathan and I just quickly grabbed the camera, sat down here to address a few questions.
The Lamb family, once united in their faith and their work with Daystar Television Network, began to unravel after Marcus Lamb's death. At first, the entire family was focused on mourning his sudden passing, as he had been the face of the network and a beloved figure in Christian media. But as the weeks went by, something didn't feel right. Joni Lamb, Marcus's widow, seemed to be moving forward far too quickly. While it was understandable for her to grieve, the speed at which she began to embrace a new relationship with Doug Weiss raised concerns among family members and those close to the Lambs. Joni had always been the supportive wife, standing by Marcus's side as they built Daystar together. But after Marcus's death, she was thrust into the public spotlight, and her behavior quickly began to raise eyebrows. Within just weeks of Marcus's passing, Joni was seen growing increasingly close to Doug Weiss, a counselor who had been involved with the Lamb family for years. At first, their relationship seemed innocent, just a professional connection, as Joni navigated her grief. However, as time passed, it became apparent that something was changing. Joni and Doug began spending more time together, appearing at events as a couple, and their closeness became hard to ignore. The timing of it all felt strange. Just 2 months after Marcus's death, Doug filed for divorce from his wife of over 30 years. Jonathan and Susie Lamb, Marcus's son and daughter-in-law, began to notice the shift and started to voice their discomfort. They had always been close to Joni and Marcus, working alongside them in the ministry for years. But now they were finding it difficult to understand Joni's rapid transition. To them, it didn't seem like a natural grieving process. The way Joni was moving on, so quickly and with someone so close to the family, felt wrong. They began to question whether this was truly about grief, or if there was something else at play. The Lamb family, which had once been united in purpose and vision, was starting to divide. Jonathan and Susie felt like they were losing their connection with Joni, the woman they had once trusted. They couldn't understand how she could move on so fast, especially with Doug, someone who had been involved in their lives for so long. As the tension grew, it wasn't just about Joni's relationship with Doug. It was about trust. Jonathan and Susie began to feel like the values their family had built Daystar on were being replaced by something else entirely. Joni's actions were not only affecting their personal relationship with her, but were also impacting the future of the ministry they had all worked so hard to build. Joni's increasing control over Daystar's direction, the way she was making decisions without consulting others, and the way she pushed certain voices out, created a sense of unease within the family and the network. It was clear that Joni was no longer the same woman they had known, the devoted wife and mother who had always been there for them. The divide within the family became more apparent as Jonathan and Susie continued to speak out about their concerns. Joni, instead of addressing their worries, became more defensive. She justified her relationship with Doug, insisting that they were simply friends who had found comfort in each other during a difficult time. But for Jonathan and Susie, her explanations didn't ring true. They felt like they were being shut out, like their concerns were being dismissed in favor of Joni's new path. The more they tried to talk to her, the more isolated they became. They no longer recognized the woman who had once been a mother figure to them. The family that had once been united was now fractured, and the trust that had held them together was quickly fading.